The story of metamodernism does not begin in a vacuum. It unfolds across centuries, across the echoing halls of Enlightenment salons, the storm-tossed cabins of romantic poets, the stark white factories of Bauhaus workshops, and the neon-lit galleries of pop culture critics. To understand the oscillation that characterizes metamodern thought, we must first map the intellectual terrain that preceded it, tracing the rise of modernist confidence and the subsequent emergence of postmodern skepticism. Let us walk together through that historical prelude, pausing to listen to the voices of Kant, Hegel, Lyotard, Derrida, and Baudrillard, and to feel the tremors of two vivid moments that still reverberate in our cultural imagination. The 1913 Armory show that shocked American art, and the heated culture wars debates of the 1970s that turned the very notion of artistic value into a battlefield. It begins, of course, with the Enlightenment, a period that, in the words of Immanuel Kant, demanded that we dare to know. Sapere aude. The 18th century philosophers placed unshakable faith in human reason, in the belief that the world could be understood, categorized, and ultimately improved through the application of rational principles. For Kant, reason was not merely a tool but a moral compass. Two things fill the mind with ever-increasing awe: the starry heavens above and the moral law within. The Enlightenment project was, at its core, an expansive optimism. The conviction that the human mind could ascend from the darkness of superstition into the clear light of knowledge. This faith in universal rationality gave rise to a new political imagination, one that imagined societies organized not by divine right, but by laws that could be articulated, debated, and refined. Yet the very same confidence that illuminated the age also sowed the seeds of its own critique. The Romantic Revolt, emerging in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, turned a questioning eye toward the limits of reason. Poets like William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge argued that the rational mind, while powerful, could not capture the full depth of human experience. In his preface to Lyrical Ballads, Wordsworth wrote, "Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, recollected in tranquility." The Romantics celebrated intuition, emotion, and the sublime, the sense of being humbled before nature's vastness. Their emphasis on the individual imagination introduced a tension. Reason could map the world, but feeling could only be felt, not measured. This tension would later become a central fault line between modernist grand narratives and postmodern deconstruction. Modernism, which began to coalesce in the late 19th century, inherited both the Enlightenment's rational ambition and the Romantics' yearning for depth. It sought to synthesize the two, proposing that humanity could construct overarching narratives, grand narratives, as Jean-François Lyotard would later call them, that would explain history, culture, and the self. G.W.F. Hegel famously declared that the owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the falling of the dusk, suggesting that philosophy, like an owl, can only understand reality in retrospect, but that it also shapes the future through its dialectical synthesis. For Hegel, history was a rational process, a progressive unfolding of the world's spirit toward greater freedom. He imagined a world where contradictions were resolved in higher syntheses, where the individual's freedom was realized within the rational state. Kant, too, contributed a framework for modernist optimism. In his critique of pure reason, he distinguished between the phenomena that our senses present and the noumena that lie beyond our grasp, yet he insisted that the former could be organized by universal categories of understanding. He famously posited that the categorical imperative, to act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law, provided a moral architecture that could guide societies toward ethical coherence. The modernist project, then, was built on the belief that through reason, art, science, and politics could converge on a shared, progressive truth. In the realm of art and design, this optimism found concrete expression in the Bauhaus school, founded by Walter Gropius in 1919. The Bauhaus declared that art and technology, a new unity. Its sleek functionalist designs, its emphasis on geometry and industrial materials, embodied the modernist conviction that aesthetics could serve a universal, democratic purpose. A Bauhaus chair, stripped of ornament, was meant to be a rational object for all people, a physical manifestation of the Enlightenment's promise that reason could improve everyday life. Yet as the 20th century unfolded, the certainties of modernism began to fray. The devastation of two world wars, the rise of mass media, and the proliferation of consumer culture revealed cracks in the grand narratives. The post-World War II era gave birth to a new philosophical stance, postmodernism. It was a turn toward skepticism, toward the idea that the very foundations upon which modernist grand narratives rested were not only contestable, but perhaps illusory. Jean-François Lyotard, in his seminal work The Postmodern Condition, declared that the most characteristic sign of the postmodern is the incredulity toward meta-narratives. He argued that the age of grand explanations, whether Marxist, liberal, or scientific, had given way to a fragmented, pluralistic landscape where knowledge is localized, contingent, and performed. The postmodern condition, he suggested, is one of language games where power operates through the control of discourse. Jacques Derrida took this skepticism further with his method of deconstruction. In Of Grammatology, Derrida famously asserted, "There is nothing outside the text." By this, he meant that any sign, any concept, is always already embedded in a network of other signs. Meaning is never fixed, but endlessly deferred. Derrida's relentless questioning of binary oppositions, presence/absence, speech/writing, truth/fiction, undermined the modernist confidence that language could faithfully capture an objective reality. Jean Baudrillard, meanwhile, introduced the notion of hyperreality. In Simulacra and Simulation, he wrote, "The simulacrum is never that which conceals the truth, it is truth that conceals truth." For Baudrillard, the proliferation of images and signs in late capitalist society had created a world where the distinction between representation and reality collapses. The consumer's experience becomes a simulation, a copy without an original, and the promise of authentic meaning evaporates. These philosophical currents found vivid expression in two cultural flashpoints that still echo today. The first is the 1913 Armory Show, a moment that, while occurring before the formal birth of postmodernism, presaged the shock that modernist optimism would later encounter. The Armory Show, organized by the Association of American Painters and Sculptors, introduced the American public to European avant-garde works, Marcel Duchamp's nude descending a staircase, Matisse's bold Fauves canvases, and the Cubist abstractions of Picasso. When the exhibition opened in New York's 69th Regiment Armory, the reaction was a mixture of awe, bewilderment, and outright hostility. A New York Times critic wrote, "The works are not art. They are the product of a diseased mind." The public's outrage was not merely about aesthetic taste, it was a visceral response to the rupture of a familiar visual language. The Armory Show forced viewers to confront the possibility that art need not imitate nature, that representation could be abstract, that the purpose of art could shift from moral instruction to pure formal experimentation. In that moment, the optimism of the Bauhaus and the rationalist belief that art could serve a universal function met a public that was unprepared for such radical departure. The shock of the Armory Show would later be echoed in the postmodern turn toward irony and pastiche, where the very idea of a singular, authentic artistic truth would be called into question. The second vivid anecdote unfolds several decades later, in the heated culture wars debates of the 1970s. The United States, still reeling from the Vietnam War and the civil rights upheavals, found its artistic institutions at the center of political contention. The National Endowment for the Arts, NEA, a federal agency created to fund artistic excellence, became a lightning rod. In 1972, the NEA awarded a grant to the performance artist Alan Caprow for his Happenings, works that blurred the line between art and everyday life. Conservative legislators, alarmed by the perceived erosion of traditional values, demanded that taxpayer money not fund such anti-art. The debate escalated when the NEA funded the controversial video piece The Last Supper by artist Andres Serrano, which depicted a crucifix submerged in urine. The ensuing congressional hearings turned into a cultural battlefield, with senators like Jesse Helms declaring, "We cannot allow the government to fund works that insult our most sacred symbols." Artists, on the other hand, defended the right to subvert and critique, arguing that art's purpose was to challenge dominant narratives. This clash revealed a crucial shift. The modernist belief that art could elevate society through universal beauty was now contested by a postmodern insistence that art could also destabilize, deconstruct, and provoke. The culture wars underscored that the authority of grand narratives, whether religious, political, or aesthetic, was no longer taken for granted. It also illustrated how postmodern irony could be weaponized, turning the very symbols of modernist optimism into sites of subversive critique. From these anecdotes, we can distill two concrete examples of how modernist optimism transformed into postmodern irony. First, consider the Bauhaus versus pop art. The Bauhaus, with its clean lines, functional forms, and belief in design as a tool for social progress, epitomized modernist faith in the transformative power of rational aesthetics. By contrast, pop art, exemplified by Andy Warhol's silkscreened Campbell's soup cans, reappropriated mass-produced imagery, turning everyday consumer objects into high art. Warhol's famous remark, "I'm boring," was itself an ironic comment on the very notion of artistic originality. Where Bauhaus designers sought to create a universal visual language for the masses, pop artists highlighted the absurdity of that ambition by foregrounding the banal, the commercial, and the reproduced. The irony lies in the reversal. The modernist project of elevating form becomes a postmodern commentary on the commodification of culture. A second example can be found in the transition from the international style of architecture to the postmodern pastiche of the 1970s and 1980s. Architects like Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe championed the international style, glass, steel, and minimal ornament, as expressions of universal, timeless principles. Their credo, less is more, suggested that architecture could transcend cultural particularities. Yet by the 1970s, architects such as Robert Venturi began to mock that very purity. In his book Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, Venturi declared, "Less is a bore." He advocated for a decorated shed that embraced historical references, eclectic ornament, and a playful mixture of styles. This was not merely a stylistic shift, it was an ironic critique that exposed the hubris of modernist universalism. By reintroducing historical quotations and pluralist aesthetics, postmodern architects signaled that the claim to a single, rational architectural language had been, in fact, a cultural imposition. These transformations, however, do not sit unchallenged. There are two prominent counterarguments that question the narrative of a clean rupture between modernism and postmodernism. The first asserts that postmodernism never fully broke modernist structures, rather it repurposed them. Critics point out that many postmodern theorists, Lyotard, Derrida, Baudrillard, still operated within the very linguistic and conceptual frameworks that modernism had established. Derrida's deconstruction, for instance, relies on the modernist notion of the text as a coherent, analyzable object, even as he seeks to destabilize its meaning. Similarly, Lyotard's analysis of language games presupposes the modernist belief in the power of discourse to shape reality. In this view, postmodernism is less a rupture and more a continuation, a sophisticated, self-reflexive turn that acknowledges modernism's achievements while exposing its blind spots. The irony, then, is that the postmodern critique itself is built upon the scaffolding of modernist thought. The second counterargument suggests that the shift from modernism to postmodernism should be understood as a continuity rather than a rupture. Some scholars argue that the seeds of postmodern skepticism were already present in late modernist works. Think of the early 20th century literary experiments of James Joyce or Virginia Woolf, whose stream of consciousness techniques already destabilized linear narratives. Or the Dada movement, which, with its anti-art provocations, foreshadowed postmodern irony. Even within the architecture of the Bauhaus, there were debates about ornament, function, and the social role of design, debates that would later be taken up by postmodern critics. Moreover, the notion of the end of history, famously articulated by Francis Fukuyama in 1992, can be read not as a definitive closure, but as a continuation of the modernist trajectory, a claim that liberal democracy had finally resolved the dialectical conflicts of history. Yet many postmodern thinkers, including Baudrillard, would later argue that this end was itself a simulation, a hyperreal narrative that obscured the endless play of signs. Thus, the line between modernist confidence and postmodern doubt is porous, and the transition appears as a long, winding dialogue rather than a sudden break. To appreciate these nuances, it helps to cross-reference the idea of the end of history with Baudrillard's concept of hyperreality. Fukuyama's thesis proclaimed that with the universalization of liberal democracy and market capitalism, humanity had reached the final form of government, and ideological evolution would cease. This proclamation echoed modernist optimism. History, like a rational process, could be guided toward a definitive end. Baudrillard, however, would later argue that in the age of simulacra, the end of history is itself a simulation, a narrative constructed to mask the endless proliferation of copies that have no original. In a hyperreal world, the claim of an endpoint becomes a self-referential sign, detached from any concrete reality. The tension between these two perspectives illustrates how postmodern thought does not simply discard modernist narratives, but reinterprets them through a lens of irony, simulation, and perpetual deferral. When we place these intellectual currents alongside the two vivid anecdotes, The Armory Show's shock to American art and the 1970s culture wars debate, we see a pattern of oscillation. The Armory Show disrupted the modernist belief that art could serve a universal, rational purpose, exposing the public's resistance to abstraction and the fragility of aesthetic consensus. The culture wars debates, decades later, revealed how postmodern irony could be weaponized to challenge institutional authority, turning the very mechanisms of cultural funding into sites of contestation. Both moments illustrate a pendulum swing, from confidence to doubt, from grand narratives to fragmented, ironic critiques. And it is precisely this pendulum that metamodernism seeks to capture. Metamodernism does not deny the value of modernist optimism, nor does it reject the postmodern critique. Instead, it proposes a new oscillation, a dynamic movement that alternates between earnest aspiration and skeptical distance, between constructive hope and ironic awareness. It is a philosophy of both slash and, not either slash or. In the words of the cultural theorist Robin van den Akker, metamodernism is the structure of feeling that moves between the poles of modernist enthusiasm and postmodern irony. To see how this oscillation might play out, imagine a contemporary architect designing a public library. A modernist approach would emphasize functional efficiency, clean lines, and a universal aesthetic that serves all users equally. A postmodern approach might deconstruct that universalism, inserting eclectic references, playful signage, and a collage of historical styles to highlight the plurality of meanings. A metamodern architect, in contrast, might begin with the modernist intention to create an inclusive space for knowledge, while simultaneously acknowledging the postmodern awareness that any design is already laden with cultural assumptions. The result could be a building that is both functional and self-reflexive, a glass facade that reveals the surrounding cityscape, while an interior mural subtly references local histories, thereby marrying optimism with irony in a single gesture. The philosophical lineage that leads us here is rich and tangled. Kant's categorical imperative, with its universal moral law, finds a distant echo in contemporary discussions of climate ethics, where global responsibility is invoked alongside an awareness of cultural particularities. Hegel's dialectic, with its thesis-antithesis, the idea of metamodernism, first appears, almost like a breath drawn after a long exhalation of postmodern irony, as an invitation to move beyond the endless play of deconstruction and instead to sit with a paradoxical mixture of hope and doubt. It is not a simple return to the earnestness of modernism, nor is it a clever remix of postmodern pastiche. It is an oscillation, a pendulum that swings between two poles that have, for decades, seemed mutually exclusive. On one side, we have the modernist conviction that truth can be approached through reason, that progress is possible, that art can serve a higher purpose. On the other side, we have the postmodern awareness that any claim to truth is already entangled in language, power, and the endless game of signifiers, that sincerity itself can become a performance. Metamodernism, as articulated by Timotheus Vermeulen and Robin van den Akker, asks us to hold both at once, to feel the tension without collapsing into either nihilistic cynicism or naive optimism. In the words of Vermeulen, we are caught in a structure of oscillation, a double movement that refuses to settle. This double movement becomes the core logic of the metamodern condition. To make sense of this oscillation, Vermeulen and van den Akker propose a threefold schema that maps the phenomenon onto structure, effect, and epistemology. The structural dimension refers to the way cultural texts and practices are organized. It is not merely a formalist description of genre or medium, but a recognition that contemporary works often embed within themselves a tension between a modernist narrative arc and a post-modern self-reflexive interruption. The affective dimension concerns the emotional experience of the audience. Here, the oscillation is felt as a simultaneous surge of longing and irony, a bittersweet yearning that acknowledges the limits of its own hope. Finally, the epistemic dimension asks how we claim to know anything at all in this state of double movement. It posits that knowledge is provisional, that we can pursue truth while remaining aware of its contingency, and that the very act of knowing is itself a form of ethical engagement with the world. When we listen to the music of Arcade Fire, these three dimensions become audible. Their 2010 album, The Suburbs, opens with a nostalgic reverie for small-town life, a modernist yearning for a lost authenticity, only to undercut it with lyrical irony that points to the commodification of that very nostalgia. The structure of the record alternates between anthemic, earnest choruses and fragmented, almost spoken-word interludes that remind us we are listening to a constructed narrative. The affect is palpable. The swelling strings and choir-like harmonies stir a feeling of collective hope, while the lyrical references to the same old story and the lies we tell ourselves inject a self-critical edge. Epistemologically, the band seems to be saying that we can still imagine a better future, even as we acknowledge the historical forces that have shaped our present. As the song Ready to Start declares, we are the new generation, we are the ones who will carry the torch. Yet the line is delivered with a vocal tremor that hints at uncertainty, a tonal oscillation that mirrors the metamodern logic of holding hope and doubt together. The architecture of Bjarke Ingels' group, often abbreviated as BIG, offers a concrete spatial illustration of the same schema. Take the 8 house in Copenhagen, a building that physically folds over itself, forming a figure 8 that invites both communal interaction and private retreat. Structurally, the design subverts the modernist mantra of form follows function by embedding a playful, almost ironic loop that challenges the straightforward logic of a linear street facade. Yet the building also earnestly proposes a new model of sustainable urban living, integrating green roofs, bike paths, and communal spaces that speak to a genuine desire to improve social conditions. A visitor walking through the building experiences an effective oscillation, the awe of the sweeping curve, the delight of unexpected balconies, and the subtle awareness that this is a curated spectacle, a designed optimism that might be read as a marketing ploy. Epistemologically, Ingels often frames his projects as pragmatic utopias, a phrase that acknowledges the aspirational nature of architecture while grounding it in engineering realities. In his own words, we want to make the impossible possible, but we also want to be honest about the constraints. This admission captures the metamodern balance between the earnest pursuit of a better world and the postmodern recognition of limits. The thinkers behind the theory deserve careful introduction, because their own intellectual trajectories embody the oscillation they describe. Timotheus Vermeulen, a Dutch cultural theorist, emerged from a background of media studies and philosophy, and his early work on the postmodern sensibility laid the groundwork for a more nuanced articulation of what would become metamodernism. Robin van den Akker, also Dutch, brings a phenomenological lens, emphasizing the lived experience of cultural moments and the affective currents that run beneath them. Together, they co-authored the seminal essay Notes on Metamodernism, in which they outline the threefold schema and argue that contemporary culture is characterized by a structure of oscillation. Their collaboration reflects the very dialogic process that metamodernism champions. A conversation across disciplinary borders between theory and practice, between optimism and critique. A third voice, that of Seth Abramson, a literary theorist and poet, expands the conversation into the realm of narrative and myth. Abramson's work on the post-metamodern narrative suggests that stories now operate on a double helix of sincerity and irony, weaving together archetypal quests with self-referential commentary. In his essay, The Metamodern Narrative, he writes, "We are no longer content to tell stories that either wholly affirm or wholly deconstruct. We now tell stories that acknowledge their own construction while still reaching for something transcendent." Abramson's emphasis on the literary dimension enriches the metamodern schema by showing how the oscillation is not limited to visual or musical media, but permeates the very way we construct meaning through language. Of course, no philosophical movement is without its critics, and metamodernism has attracted two prominent lines of opposition. The first comes from cultural commentators who argue that metamodernism is little more than a marketing label, a fashionable tag that allows galleries, record labels, and design firms to rebrand themselves as forward-thinking without committing to any substantive change. They point to the proliferation of metamodern exhibitions and conferences as evidence that the term has become a buzzword, stripped of analytical rigor. As one critic, the cultural journalist Simon Reynolds, put it, "We are witnessing a rebranding of the same old postmodern cynicism, now dressed in pastel optimism." This critique suggests that the oscillation is superficial, a veneer that conceals the continuity of postmodern practices. A second, more philosophical line of critique comes from scholars who contend that metamodernism, despite its talk of hope and sincerity, ultimately reinscribes the same power structures that modernism and postmodernism sought to destabilize. Drawing on the work of feminist theorist Nancy Fraser and the post-colonial critique of Gayatri Spivak, these philosophers argue that the hope championed by metamodernism often aligns with neoliberal narratives of individual agency and self-optimization, thereby obscuring systemic inequities. In their view, the oscillation between earnestness and irony can become a way to neutralize radical critique. The sincere moment offers a brief glimpse of possibility, while the ironic moment quickly pulls the viewer back into a safe distance, preventing sustained political action. As the philosopher Rossi Braidotti warns, the seductive promise of a new hope can become a soft form of governance, a way to keep dissent within the bounds of acceptable affect. This line of criticism urges us to examine whether metamodernism's double movement truly opens new ethical spaces, or whether it simply repackages existing hierarchies. Historical anecdotes help to ground these abstract debates in concrete moments when the oscillation seemed to surface in the public sphere. The first anecdote is the 2008 financial crisis, a cataclysm that shattered the confidence of modernist progress and exposed the fragility of the neoliberal order. In the immediate aftermath, a wave of artistic responses emerged that blended a palpable sense of loss with a renewed yearning for collective purpose. Street murals in cities like New York and Berlin, for example, combined stark, realist depictions of foreclosed homes with hopeful slogans such as "We will rebuild." The structure of these works juxtaposed documentary realism, a modernist impulse toward truth-telling, with a postmodern layering of text that invited viewers to question the very act of representation. The affect was a mixture of grief and a tentative optimism that seemed to say, "We have been broken, but we can imagine a different future." Epistemologically, these artworks refused to settle on a single narrative. They presented multiple, sometimes contradictory, perspectives on the crisis, embodying the metamodern oscillation between acknowledging systemic failure and daring to imagine renewal. Critics later noted that this return to hope was not a naive denial of the crisis, but a strategic effective response that aimed to mobilize collective agency in a moment of disillusionment. The second anecdote occurs at the 2012 London Olympics, an event meticulously choreographed to project a sense of collective optimism on a global stage. The opening ceremony, directed by Danny Boyle, wove together a montage of British cultural icons, industrial steam engines, punk rock, and the whimsical Jelly Baby mascot, into a narrative that celebrated both the nation's gritty history and its aspirational future. Structurally, the ceremony oscillated between earnest historical homage and tongue-in-cheek pastiche, moving fluidly from a solemn tribute to the victims of war to a playful, almost ironic rendition of the London Bridge dance. The effective experience for the global audience was a carefully calibrated swell of pride, nostalgia, and a knowing wink that said, "We are aware of the spectacle, yet we are invited to feel it sincerely." On an epistemic level, the Olympics served as a staged moment where the world could collectively suspend its critical distance, allowing a temporary alignment of hope and national identity, before the inevitable return to the ordinary politics of economics and power. Some scholars, such as the cultural theorist Nick Kudry, have argued that the Olympics functioned as a carnivalesque moment that, while appearing to transcend politics, actually reinforced existing power structures by presenting a sanitized, optimistic narrative that masked deeper inequalities. This reading underscores the metamodern tension. The event was both a genuine expression of collective aspiration and a performative display that could be read as a sophisticated form of soft power. To deepen our understanding of the oscillation, it is useful to cross-reference metamodernism with Kant's notion of the sublime and Bakhtin's concept of the tragicomic. Kant described the sublime as an experience that simultaneously overwhelms the mind with a sense of boundless magnitude and yet affirms the power of human reason to comprehend it. The feeling of awe in the face of a towering mountain, for instance, is both terrifying and uplifting because the mind recognizes its own capacity to rise above the mere sensory impression. Metamodernism echoes this duality. The modernist earnestness seeks the sublime in the form of grand narratives and moral projects, while postmodern irony introduces a critical distance that reminds us of our finitude. The oscillation, then, can be seen as a contemporary articulation of the sublime, where hope and doubt coexist in a dynamic tension that pushes us to expand our imaginative horizons. Bakhtin's tragicomic, on the other hand, describes a mode of storytelling that fuses the tragic, an awareness of suffering, loss, or existential absurdity, with the comic, which offers relief through laughter, parody, or absurdity. The tragicomic does not resolve the tension between the two, rather it sustains it, allowing the audience to experience both simultaneously. In metamodern literature, we see this pattern repeated. A narrative may present a protagonist's earnest quest for meaning, only to undercut it with a self-referential joke that reminds us of the constructed nature of the quest. The tragicomic thus provides a literary analog to the metamodern oscillation, reinforcing the idea that sincerity and irony are not mutually exclusive but mutually enriching. Returning to the threefold schema, let us examine how each dimension interacts with these philosophical cross-references. In the structural realm, the integration of the sublime and the tragicomic can be seen in the way contemporary works blend high and low forms, seriousness and playfulness, in a single compositional framework. Arcade Fire's The Suburbs does this by pairing a soaring, almost hymn-like chorus, a nod to the sublime, with verses that list mundane, almost banal details of suburban life, thereby invoking a tragicomic perspective that both elevates and demystifies the subject. In architecture, Bjarkengel's 8-house structures its circulation routes to create a literal loop, a symbol of infinity that hints at the sublime, while the playful figure 8 shape functions as a visual joke, a wink at the conventional grid. Both examples demonstrate how the structural element of metamodernism is a hybrid space where grand aspirations and self-conscious play coexist. Effectively, the oscillation is lived through the simultaneous experience of awe and irony. When a listener hears the crescendo of "Wake Up" by Arcade Fire, the heart races, the breath catches, and a feeling of collective uplift emerges, a moment of the sublime in emotional form. Yet the same song later introduces a spoken interlude that declares, "We're all just a part of the same story," a line that pulls the listener back, reminding them that the emotional surge is mediated through cultural production. The effective oscillation thus mirrors Kant's claim that the sublime is not a pure feeling of terror, but a mediated affirmation of our rational capacities. In the architectural sphere, a visitor to the 8-house might feel exhilarated by the panoramic views and the sense of community, only to notice the overt signage that reads big in bold letters, a moment of corporate branding that injects a postmodern wink, a reminder that the awe is packaged. This effective push-pull creates a space where hope can be felt without slipping into naive optimism, and where irony can be employed without devolving into cynicism. Epistemologically, metamodernism asks us to reconsider how we claim knowledge in a world where both grand narratives and deconstructive critiques circulate. The oscillation suggests a provisional epistemology. We can pursue truth while acknowledging that any claim is already situated within power relations and linguistic frameworks. This stance resonates with Kant's critical philosophy, which holds that while we can never fully grasp the noumenal, we can still responsibly use the categories of understanding to navigate the phenomenal world. At the same time, Bakhtin's emphasis on dialogic interaction, on the idea that meaning emerges from the interplay of multiple voices, aligns with the metamodern insistence on a plural, open-ended epistemic stance. In practice, this means that a critic of a work like Arcade Fire's The Suburbs can affirm its emotional sincerity, while simultaneously interrogating the socio-economic conditions that shape its lyrical content, thereby embodying the double movement of knowledge. The counterpositions we have mentioned earlier sharpen these considerations. Critics who reduce metamodernism to a marketing label often point to the commodification of the term itself. Conference series titled Metamodern Futures, design studios branding their projects as metamodern solutions, and record labels promoting metamodern playlists. They argue that this branding strips the concept of its critical edge, turning a philosophical oscillation into a marketable aesthetic. To address this, we might ask whether the very act of branding is itself part of the oscillation. If a design firm adopts the label while genuinely attempting to integrate sustainable practices with playful forms, does the commercial packaging negate the ethical intention, or does it simply reflect the postmodern awareness that any cultural production is mediated through market forces? This question invites us to hold both the critique and the possibility of transformation in tension, a hallmark of metamodern thought. The second criticism, that metamodernism re-inscribes existing power structures, pushes us to examine the political implications of the oscillation. When a city commissions a big project that promises pragmatic utopias, the rhetoric of hope can serve as a tool for legitimizing large-scale development that may displace marginalized communities. The earnest promise of a better future is thus entangled with neoliberal calculations of profit and growth. Yet the postmodern irony embedded in the design, perhaps a conspicuous green roof that is more aesthetic than functional, can also open space for critique. By making the optimism visible and simultaneously self-aware, the oscillation can foster a public discourse that questions who benefits from the promised utopia. In this sense, the metamodern double movement may function as a strategic tension that keeps power accountable, rather than simply reproducing it. The challenge lies in ensuring that the ironic moment does not merely diffuse the earnest moment, but that both together generate a sustained political engagement. To further illustrate the practical relevance of this oscillation, consider the rise of hope-punk literature, a subgenre that emerged in the mid-2010s. Hope-punk narratives present protagonists who, despite overwhelming odds, choose to act with kindness and optimism, while simultaneously acknowledging the systemic forces that generate those odds. The structural form of hope-punk often blends traditional heroes' journey arcs with meta-narrative commentary that highlights the constructed nature of the story. The effective tone oscillates between uplifting moments, characters sharing meals. The story of metamodern ethics and politics begins where the postmodern critique of grand narratives left a vacuum, and where the yearning for meaning, for collective purpose, began to stir again. In the earlier chapters, we traced how the oscillation between irony and sincerity, between cynicism and hope, reshaped our cultural imagination. That very oscillation now finds its most urgent expression in the realm of moral and political life, where the stakes are no longer abstract debates but the climate of our planet, the distribution of public resources, and the very sense of what it means to live together in a plural world. It is here that the notion of pragmatic idealism, the willingness to hold a vision of a better future while simultaneously deploying concrete, often imperfect strategies, takes shape as a defining feature of metamodern thought. To understand this emergence, we must look back to the early 20th century crisis of modernity, when the Enlightenment promise of reason collided with the horrors of two world wars. Thinkers such as Ernst Bloch wrote of a principle of hope that could sustain humanity through its darkest moments. Yet Bloch's hope was anchored in a materialist analysis of history, a bridge between the utopian and the real. Decades later, the postmodern turn, championed by figures like Jean-François Lyotard, declared the end of metanarratives, urging us to revel in the play of language and power. The result was a profound skepticism that, while valuable, also risked dissolving any shared moral footing. Metamodernism, as articulated by Robin van den Akker, Alison Gibbons, and Timotheus Vermeulen, responds to that impasse by proposing a double movement. A sincere engagement with ideals, coupled with a pragmatic awareness of constraints. It is this double movement that undergirds what we now call hopeful pragmatism. Alain de Botton, a contemporary philosopher who writes for a broad public, captures this spirit when he says, "We should not be ashamed of our desire to be good, but we must also be honest about the difficulty of being good." De Botton's emphasis on the art of living invites us to see ethics not as a set of immutable commandments, but as a practice that blends aspiration with the messy realities of everyday life. His work on the philosophy of love, work, and travel demonstrates how ordinary decisions can be infused with a larger moral horizon, while still acknowledging the limits of what any individual can achieve. In a similar vein, Slavoj Žižek, ever the dialectical provocateur, speaks of dialectical hope as a force that refuses to settle for either naive optimism or bleak resignation. He writes, "Hope is not a feeling but a stance, an act of resistance against the forces that would render the future unthinkable." Žižek's hope is not a soft, sentimental wish. It is a radical commitment to keep the possibility of change alive, even when the present seems to conspire against it. Michael Sandel brings yet another dimension to this conversation, grounding hopeful pragmatism in the political sphere. In his seminal book Justice, Sandel argues that the common good is not an abstract ideal, but a lived conversation about what we owe each other as members of a community. He insists we must ask ourselves not only what we can do, but what we ought to do together. Sandel's emphasis on deliberative democracy resonates with the metamodern insistence on oscillation. We must move between the confidence that collective reasoning can produce just outcomes, and the humility that such reasoning is always provisional, contested, and subject to revision. From these three thinkers emerges a coherent argument: ethical and political action in the metamodern age must be both hopeful and pragmatic. The hope provides the direction, the North Star that guides our aspirations toward a more just and sustainable world. The pragmatism supplies the tools, the strategies, and the willingness to engage with imperfect institutions, to negotiate, to compromise, and to iterate. This synthesis is not a simple compromise. It is a dynamic tension that fuels creativity. It invites us to ask, for instance, how can we demand systemic change while also working within existing legal frameworks? How can we envision a climate-just future while recognizing the economic realities that bind nations together? The answer, according to the metamodern perspective, lies in embracing the oscillation, in allowing the hope to propel us forward and the pragmatism to keep us grounded. One vivid illustration of this hopeful pragmatism is the climate activist movement Extinction Rebellion, or XR. Founded in the United Kingdom in 2018, XR quickly became known for its theatrical protests. Mass die-ins, road blockades, and the iconic sunset performances where activists, illuminated by orange lights, sang protest songs in the dead of night. Yet beneath this performative layer lies a serious strategic calculus. XR's manifesto declares a non-violent civil disobedience approach, demanding that governments declare a climate emergency, achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2025, and adopt citizens' assemblies to oversee the transition. The movement's use of irony and humor, think of the glitter bomb that sprayed glitter on a corporate lobbyist, serves a dual purpose. First, it captures media attention in an oversaturated information environment, ensuring that the message reaches a broad audience. Second, it softens the confrontation, inviting onlookers to engage rather than retreat in defensive anger. In this way, Akker embodies the metamodular ethic. It holds an idealistic vision of planetary survival while employing pragmatic tactics that acknowledge the need to win hearts, not just headlines. A second, more institutional example comes from the participatory budgeting process in Porto Alegre, Brazil. Beginning in the late 1980s, Porto Alegre invited its citizens to directly allocate a portion of the municipal budget to projects they deemed most urgent, be it sanitation, education, or public transport. The process is deliberately iterative. Citizens propose ideas, discuss them in neighborhood assemblies, and then vote on the final allocation. What makes Porto Alegre a case study in hopeful pragmatism is the way it balances lofty democratic ideals with concrete administrative mechanisms. The city does not claim to have solved all inequities. Instead, it acknowledges that each budgeting cycle is a step toward a more inclusive governance model. The very act of involving ordinary residents in fiscal decisions creates a sense of collective agency, a hopeful belief that the community can shape its destiny. At the same time, the municipal bureaucracy learns to adapt, to translate popular demands into feasible projects, and to manage the inevitable trade-offs. The result is a living laboratory where idealistic aspirations for participatory democracy are tested, refined, and sometimes humbled by practical constraints. These two case studies illuminate the broader claim that metamodern ethics and politics thrive on what we might call strategic sincerity. This term captures the idea that sincerity, genuine commitment to a cause, must be paired with strategic awareness of the terrain in which one operates. In the climate arena, the urgency of the climate crisis demands bold, even radical demands. Yet the political realities of international negotiations, market forces, and entrenched interests mean that activists must also engage in coalition building, legal challenges, and incremental policy proposals. In Porto Alegre, the ideal of direct democracy is tempered by the logistical challenges of budgeting, the need for technical expertise, and the pressures of economic development. The oscillation between hope and pragmatism, between the desire to transform and the necessity to navigate, creates a resilient form of activism that can endure setbacks while maintaining its moral compass. Of course, this hopeful pragmatism is not without its critics. One line of objection argues that optimism, even when coupled with strategy, can blind us to the deep structural oppressions that undergird many of the problems we seek to address. Critics point to the risk that a feel-good narrative of collective action may obscure the ways in which power is distributed unequally, and that focusing on incremental change can inadvertently legitimize the status quo. As the feminist scholar Bell Hooks once warned, the struggle to end the oppression of women is a struggle to end oppression everywhere. From a metamodern perspective, this critique reminds us that hope must be vigilant, that our pragmatic steps must be constantly interrogated for whom they truly serve. In practice, this means that climate activists must center the voices of indigenous peoples and frontline communities, ensuring that their strategies do not simply replace one form of domination with another. Similarly, participatory budgeting must guard against the capture of the process by well-organized interest groups, lest the democratic promise become a facade for elite capture. A second counter-argument focuses on the potential for indecisiveness inherent in the perpetual oscillation between hope and doubt. If every decision is filtered through a dual lens of idealism and pragmatism, there is a danger that action becomes paralyzed by the fear of choosing the wrong path. The philosopher Charles Taylor has warned that the modern condition is one of a constant balancing act between the demands of the self and the demands of the other. In the metamodern context, this balancing act can become a perpetual pendulum, leaving movements stuck in a loop of reflection without decisive implementation. To address this, proponents of hopeful pragmatism emphasize the importance of temporary commitments, decisions made with the understanding that they can be revisited and revised as new information emerges. This approach draws on the scientific method: hypothesize, test, evaluate, and adjust. By framing decisions as provisional rather than final, metamodern actors can move forward without the paralysis that total certainty would demand. The tension between optimism and critique, between decisive action and reflective pause, finds a striking illustration in the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. The negotiations culminated in a document that was, on its face, a triumph of hopeful rhetoric. Leaders from nearly every nation gathered in a grand hall, their speeches echoing phrases like "the world can rise to the challenge" and "a new era of climate cooperation." The agreement promised to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, a target that seemed at the moment within reach. Yet the implementation phase revealed a stark contrast between aspiration and reality. Some nations failed to meet their pledged contributions, while others withdrew altogether. The nationally determined contributions mechanism, designed to be flexible, often resulted in weak, non-binding commitments. The Paris Agreement thus serves as a historical anecdote that underscores both the power and the limits of hopeful pragmatism. It shows how a collective vision can galvanize unprecedented cooperation, but also how the pragmatic details of enforcement, financing, and political will can undermine the very hopes that inspired the agreement. The lesson for metamodern politics is clear. Hope must be coupled with robust mechanisms for accountability, lest it dissolve into empty promise. A more recent anecdote, the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests, offers another lens on the interplay of earnest demands and meme culture. Across the globe, streets filled with demonstrators chanting for racial justice, police reform, and an end to systemic oppression. At the same time, the movement's visual vocabulary was saturated with internet memes, viral hashtags, and satirical art. A TikTok video of a protester dancing in front of a police car, set to a pop song, went viral and was shared millions of times. Some observers dismissed these moments as performative or slacktivist, suggesting that the meme-driven aspect diluted the seriousness of the cause. Yet a deeper reading reveals that the humor and meme culture served a strategic function. They lowered the barrier for participation, allowed younger audiences to engage, and created a shared symbolic language that transcended national borders. The blend of earnest demands with a playful, meme-laden aesthetic exemplifies the metamodern capacity to hold seriousness and irony simultaneously, to be both deeply committed and culturally savvy. It also raises the question of whether such hybridity strengthens the movement's reach or risks trivializing its core grievances, a tension that mirrors the broader debate about hopeful pragmatism's potential to both empower and dilute. To further illuminate how metamodern ethics navigates these complexities, let us turn to an analogy drawn from music. Imagine a jazz ensemble, where each musician holds a melodic line that is both improvised and rooted in a shared harmonic structure. The band members listen intently, respond to each other's cues, and collectively shape the piece in real time. The improvisation reflects hope, the creative impulse to explore new sounds, while the underlying chord progression provides the pragmatic framework that ensures coherence. If a musician were to abandon the chord changes entirely, the music would dissolve into chaos. If they clung rigidly to the written score, the performance would become stale. The beauty of jazz lies in the oscillation between these poles, a dynamic that mirrors the metamodern approach to ethics and politics, a willingness to imagine radical alternatives while staying attuned to the structural constraints that make collective action possible. Historically, the oscillation between hope and doubt can be traced back to the Enlightenment project itself. The French philosopher Voltaire famously quipped, "Optimism is the madness of those who have never been disappointed." Yet the same era produced the social contract theories of Rousseau and Locke, which were fundamentally hopeful visions of human cooperation. The subsequent revolutions, American, French, Haitian, exemplify the pattern of high idealistic aspirations colliding with pragmatic realities, often producing outcomes that fell short of the original promise. This pattern repeats throughout history, suggesting that the metamodern moment is not a rupture but an intensification of a long-standing human rhythm. We dream, we act, we adjust, we dream again. Recognizing this rhythm allows us to see hopeful pragmatism not as naive optimism, but as a historically grounded strategy that acknowledges both our capacity for change and the stubbornness of entrenched systems. In contemporary discourse, the concept of post-truth has often been invoked as a foil to metamodern ethics. Post-truth, as popularized by the Oxford English Dictionary in 2016, describes a cultural climate where objective facts become less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. The rise of misinformation, fake news, and echo chambers seems to erode the very possibility of shared moral deliberation. Metamodernism, however, does not deny the existence of post-truth. Rather, it offers a way to navigate it. By embracing both sincerity and irony, by grounding hope in concrete strategies, metamodern thinkers argue that we can rebuild a common epistemic ground without retreating into naive factualism or cynical relativism. As Zizek reminds us, the truth is not a weapon to be wielded, but a process to be sustained. In practice, this means cultivating spaces where facts are discussed alongside values, where disagreement is seen as a catalyst for deeper understanding rather than a battleground for victory. Returning to the political philosopher Michael Sandel, we see how this synthesis can be operationalized. In his discussions of the common good, Sandel emphasizes the importance of public reason, the idea that citizens must articulate their arguments in terms that can be reasonably accepted by others, even those who disagree. This public reason does not demand a consensus on every issue, but it does require a willingness to engage in dialogue that respects both the aspirational and the pragmatic dimensions of policy. For instance, when a city council debates the allocation of funds for affordable housing, the idealist perspective might argue for a universal right to shelter, while the pragmatic perspective might highlight budget constraints, zoning laws, and market dynamics. A Sandelian approach would bring both arguments to the table, seeking a policy that advances the ideal as far as the practical conditions allow, and simultaneously adjusting the practical conditions to expand the space for the ideal. This iterative negotiation embodies the metamodern ethic of hopeful pragmatism. The metamodern lens also invites us to reconsider the role of technology in ethical and political life. Digital platforms have amplified both the reach of hopeful narratives and the spread of misinformation. On the one hand, social media enables movements like Extinction Rebellion and Black Lives Matter to mobilize millions across borders, creating a sense of global solidarity that would have been unimaginable a few decades ago. On the other hand, algorithmic amplification can reinforce echo chambers, making it harder to engage with dissenting views. A hopeful, pragmatic approach to technology, then, is not to reject digital tools as inherently corrosive, nor to embrace them uncritically as panaceas. Instead, it calls for the design of platforms that encourage constructive deliberation, that surface diverse perspectives, and that embed mechanisms for accountability. Initiatives such as deliberative polling and civic tech startups that facilitate participatory budgeting online exemplify how technology can be harnessed to serve the metamodern ethic. In the realm of international relations, hopeful pragmatism can be seen in the concept of soft power reimagined as ethical soft power. Traditional soft power, as coined by Joseph Nye, refers to the ability of a country to shape preferences through culture, values, and institutions rather than coercion. Metamodern scholars argue that ethical soft power must combine an aspirational narrative, such as a commitment to climate justice or human rights, with concrete diplomatic strategies like technology transfer agreements, climate finance mechanisms, and joint research initiatives. This blend ensures that the moral appeal is backed by tangible actions, reducing the risk that rhetoric becomes mere window dressing. When the European Union frames its Green Deal as a just transition, it is offering a hopeful vision of a sustainable. The story of metamodernism begins not with a single manifesto, but with a quiet shift that rippled through literature, film, visual art, and digital media in the early 21st century. It is a shift that feels at once nostalgic and forward-looking, earnest and ironic, hopeful and anxious. To understand how this sensibility takes shape on the page, on the screen, and in the gallery, we must first listen to the voices that articulate it, then watch how those voices are echoed in the works we encounter every day. In this segment, we will wander through the corridors of contemporary culture, pausing at the novels that stretch the limits of narrative, at television series that invite us to cheer for the underdog while quietly exposing our own contradictions, and at installations that turn light and water into metaphors for collective feeling. Along the way, we will meet thinkers who celebrate this both slash and spirit, and critics who warn that its softness may mute the radical edge that once defined avant-garde protest. By the end, you may find yourself recognizing the same pattern of self-reflexive sincerity in a poem you read in the 1990s, in a slow-moving film you watched in a quiet cinema, and in a digital meme that circulates on your phone, each a thread in the larger tapestry of metamodern cultural expression. Let us begin with literature, the oldest of the artistic mediums we will explore. David Foster Wallace's magnum opus, Infinite Jest, is often cited as a prototype of metamodern narrative. The novel, published in 1996, arrives at a moment when postmodern irony had already been exhausted. Its sprawling structure, footnote after footnote, and its relentless focus on addiction, entertainment, and the search for authenticity seem at first to be a parody of the very systems it depicts. Yet buried within that parody is a yearning for genuine connection, a plea that Wallace himself once summed up in an interview. I think the only thing that can rescue us from the emptiness of postmodern irony is the willingness to be earnest, to be vulnerable, to be sincere. When the narrator in Infinite Jest describes the entropic collapse of meaning in a world saturated with media, the reader is simultaneously invited to laugh at the absurdity and to feel the ache of those characters who cannot escape their own longing. This dual movement, simultaneously mocking and affirming, is what scholars call self-reflexive sincerity. The text constantly points to its own artifice. The endless footnotes remind us that we are reading a construction. At the same time, the emotional core of the novel, Hal's struggle with his own sense of self, Don Gately's attempts at redemption, asks us to take those feelings seriously, not as a joke but as a genuine human experience. The technique of self-reflexive sincerity does not stop at Wallace's novel. It reappears in the television series Ted Lasso, which debuted on Apple TV Plus in 2020. On the surface, Ted Lasso is a light-hearted comedy about an American football coach who, despite knowing nothing about soccer, becomes the head coach of a Premier League team. The humor is obvious, the jokes are frequent, and the show revels in its own optimism. Yet, each episode is laced with moments that break the fourth wall of emotional expectation. When Ted, played by Jason Sudeikis, delivers a heartfelt, believed speech, the camera lingers on the faces of his players, allowing us to feel their doubts and hopes. Later, in a scene where Ted confides his own insecurities to his therapist, the series pulls back from its own buoyancy to reveal a raw, unfiltered vulnerability. The audience is made aware that the show's optimism is a deliberate narrative choice, not a naive worldview. As the series creator Bill Lawrence has said, "We're trying to make something that feels honest about being hopeful, without pretending that hope is a simple, unproblematic thing." Here, the show embodies the metamodern, both slash and storytelling mode. It is simultaneously a sitcom and a meditation on mental health, a celebration of community and an indictment of toxic masculinity. The series does not resolve this tension. It lives within it, inviting viewers to sit with the discomfort of hope that is both earnest and aware of its own constructedness. Moving from the screen to the gallery, the visual installations of Olafur Eliasson provide a striking illustration of metamodern aesthetics in three-dimensional space. Eliasson's work often employs natural phenomena, light, water, temperature to create immersive environments that blur the boundary between observer and artwork. In his 2003 installation The Weather Project at the Tate Modern, Eliasson filled the turbine hall with a gigantic, artificial sun made of monospectrally filtered lamps, while a fine mist created a sense of atmospheric presence. Visitors were invited to lie on the floor to feel the heat, to watch their own reflections in the mirrored ceiling. The installation is at once a spectacle that draws awe, reminiscent of the romantic fascination with the sublime, and a scientific demonstration of how light behaves, echoing the Enlightenment's rational curiosity. Eliasson himself has described his intent: "I want to make people aware that they are part of a larger system, that the world is not a static backdrop but a living, breathing environment we inhabit together." The piece asks viewers to experience sincerity, genuine wonder at natural forces, while simultaneously recognizing the artifice of the constructed environment. In this way, Eliasson's work exemplifies the metamodern, both slash and approach. It is a celebration of natural beauty and a critique of our mediated relationship to that beauty. Both Wallace's novel, Sasso's series, and Eliasson's installations share a narrative technique that we can call self-reflexive sincerity. This term captures the moment when a work acknowledges its own artifice, its own mechanisms of representation, while still reaching out with an earnest emotional appeal. It is a step beyond postmodern irony, which often used self-reflexivity to deflate meaning. In metamodernism, self-reflexivity is paired with a sincere desire to connect, to build, to heal. It is as if the artist says, "I know I am playing a role, but I need you to take this role seriously." The audience is then invited to hold both the joke and the truth in the same breath. The second narrative technique that defines metamodern cultural production is the both slash and storytelling mode. Unlike binary oppositions that force a choice, irony versus sincerity, hope versus despair, both slash and embraces paradox as a productive space. In literature, this can be seen in the way Infinite Jest juxtaposes the hyper-technological future of an entertainment empire with the timeless yearning for authentic human connection. In Ted Lasso, the series weaves together the language of sports commentary, a world of statistics, wins, losses, with the intimate language of therapy and emotional honesty. In Eliasson's installations, the scientific precision of light measurement coexists with the ineffable feeling of awe. The both slash and mode does not resolve the tension. It holds it open, allowing the work to oscillate, to shift, to invite the viewer to experience the moment of dissonance as a site of possibility. To deepen our understanding of these techniques, we must also listen to the critical voices that challenge the optimism of metamodernism. Alexei Uwachak, a cultural historian known for his work on late Soviet culture, offers a pointed critique when he describes contemporary metamodern aesthetics as a form of hyper-modern nostalgia. In an essay published in Cultural Critique in 2019, Uwachak writes, "The yearning for sincerity that permeates metamodern art is often a nostalgic reconstruction of a past that never truly existed. It risks turning radical critique into a comforting lullaby." He argues that by wrapping social critique in a veneer of warmth, artists may inadvertently soften the edge needed to confront systemic injustice. Uwachak's concern is that the both slash and mode, while aesthetically rich, can become a form of aesthetic complacency, where the tension between hope and critique is never pushed to a point of rupture. A related criticism comes from feminist media scholar Sarah Ahmed, who contends that the metamodern turn dilutes radical critique by privileging effective solidarity over structural analysis. Ahmed points to the proliferation of feel-good narratives in streaming platforms, arguing that they often sidestep the underlying economic and political mechanisms that produce the very conditions they depict. She asks, when a series like Ted Lasso celebrates community and kindness, does it also ask us to consider the labor exploitation behind the sports industry, or does it simply make us feel better about the status quo? This question forces us to examine whether the emotional resonance of metamodern works is matched by a willingness to interrogate the power structures they inhabit. These critiques do not invalidate the significance of metamodern artistic expression, but they remind us to keep the radical edge alive. In the earlier political section of this series, we discussed how cultural products can inspire civic engagement, how a song can become an anthem for protest, how a novel can spark public debate, how a visual installation can galvanize community action. Metamodern works, with their blend of sincerity and self-awareness, have the potential to mobilize audiences in a way that pure irony cannot. Yet, as Uwachak and Ahmed caution, that potential is realized only when the works are coupled with concrete calls to action, when the emotional investment translates into political participation. In Infinite Jest, for example, the depiction of the Annette House recovery community invites readers to consider the realities of addiction treatment, potentially prompting advocacy for better health policies. In Ted Lasso, the emphasis on mental health and emotional openness can encourage viewers to seek therapy or support others in doing so. In Eliassen's The Weather Project, the public's collective experience of the installation sparked conversations about climate change, leading some museums to host panels on environmental responsibility. The metamodern sensibility, therefore, can act as a bridge between feeling and doing, between personal transformation and collective action. To appreciate the lineage of metamodernism, we must also look back at historical moments that prefigure its twin pillars of self-reflexive sincerity and both slash and storytelling. In the early 1990s, a movement known as New Sincerity emerged among American poets such as David Foster Wallace's contemporary, the poet and essayist David Lehman, and the novelist and poet David Foster Wallace himself, who contributed to the anthology The New Sincerity. Essays on the Future of American Culture, 1999. These writers pushed back against the detached irony that characterized the 1980s, insisting that the act of feeling is not a weakness but a necessary act of resistance. In a 1995 interview, poet John Kinsella declared, "We are tired of the endless sarcasm. We want to say something that matters, even if it sounds naive." This insistence on earnestness, even when it risked being perceived as naive, laid the groundwork for the metamodern embrace of sincerity that is simultaneously aware of its own potential for self-delusion. Another antecedent can be found in the rise of slow cinema during the 2000s, a movement championed by directors such as Andrei Tarkovsky, Bela Tarr, and later, Hong Sang-soo. Slow cinema is characterized by long takes, minimal dialogue, and a deliberate pacing that forces the viewer to sit with the image, to experience time as it unfolds. In a 2008 essay, film theorist David Bordwell noted, "The slow cinema aesthetic asks us to be present, to watch without the safety net of rapid cuts and narrative shortcuts." This aesthetic aligns with metamodernism's both slash and mode by refusing to offer a tidy, fast-forwarded resolution. Instead, it invites contemplation, a kind of patient sincerity that trusts the audience to find meaning in the unhurried. The movement also reflects a critique of the hyper-fast, attention-fragmenting media environment, echoing Uwachak's concerns about hyper-modern nostalgia. By slowing down, these films create a space where the viewer can experience both the beauty of the image and the underlying social or existential tension it carries. These historical anecdotes demonstrate that metamodernism is not a sudden rupture, but an evolution of existing currents. The New Sincerity's call for earnest expression and slow cinema's invitation to dwell in the moment converge in contemporary works that blend irony with hope, speed with contemplation. The metamodern artist, then, inherits a lineage that includes the Romantic poets, the modernist experimenters, the postmodern deconstructors, and the early 20th century avant-garde who sought to dissolve the barrier between art and life. In this sense, metamodernism can be seen as a dialectical synthesis, a Hegelian Aufhebung, that preserves the critical edge of its predecessors while transcending their limitations. Let us return to the concrete examples that illustrate these ideas in practice. In Infinite Jest, one of the most striking passages occurs when the narrator describes the entertainment system, a network of addictive media that promises endless pleasure. The text reads, "The truth is that there is no such thing as an entertainment system that does not also have a built-in mechanism for self-destruction." This line is both a critique of capitalist commodification and a confession of the character's own vulnerability. The footnote that follows explains the origin of the phrase, referencing a 1970s advertising slogan, thereby exposing the intertextuality of the novel. The reader is made aware of the constructed nature of the critique, yet the emotional weight remains. This is self-reflexive sincerity in action. In Ted Lasso, a pivotal episode, The Hope That Kills You, shows Ted confronting his own limitations after a series of losses. He confides to his assistant coach, "I'm scared, Roy. I'm scared that I'm not good enough for the people who believe in me." The camera lingers on his face, allowing the audience to feel his anxiety. Immediately after, the scene cuts to a montage of the team's small victories, accompanied by a song that feels almost too uplifting for the moment. The juxtaposition forces viewers to hold both the raw confession and the hopeful music together. The series does not resolve the tension, it lives within it, inviting viewers to sit with the discomfort of hope that is both earnest and aware of its own constructedness. Olafur Eliasson's 2013 installation Your Rainbow Panorama at the Aarhus Aarhus Art Museum offers another vivid illustration of both slash and storytelling. The circular walkway made of colored glass panels refracts light so that visitors see the city's skyline through a spectrum of hues. As one walks, the experience shifts from disorienting to exhilarating. Eliasson has spoken about the work's intention. "I wanted to create a place where people could see the world in a new way, but also recognize that the world is always the same." The colors are a metaphor for our emotional states, constantly changing yet grounded in the same reality. The installation simultaneously celebrates the transformative power of perception and acknowledges the constancy of the environment, embodying the both slash and logic that defines metamodern art. Beyond these three flagship works, we can identify a broader cultural pattern in digital media. The rise of micro-documentaries on platforms like Instagram and TikTok often blends personal storytelling with social commentary. A creator might post a short video about their experience with climate anxiety, overlaying statistics about carbon emissions while also sharing a moment of quiet reflection in a forest. The format forces the creator to be both informative and intimate, to use the aesthetic of personal vlog while delivering a broader critique. This digital incarnation of self-reflexive sincerity mirrors the same metamodern impulse that drives Wallace, Sasso, and Eliasson. To make the personal political without sacrificing authenticity. The metamodern sensibility also finds expression in music, particularly in the resurgence of indie folk that combines lo-fi production with lyrical earnestness. Artists like Bon Iver and Sufjan Stevens craft songs that feel like diary entries, yet they are layered with complex instrumentation that hints at an awareness of artifice. In Bon Iver's 2011 song Holocene, the lyric, "And at once I knew I was not magnificent slash, but I still felt like the universe," captures the simultaneous humility and grandeur that metamodernism celebrates. The song's sparse acoustic arrangement juxtaposed with lush vocal harmonies creates a soundscape that is both intimate and expansive, a musical both slash and. Returning to the political dimension, we can see how metamodern cultural products have been mobilized for civic engagement. In 2021, a community art project in Detroit invited residents to co-create a mural inspired by Eliasson's light installations, using reflective materials to symbolize hope amidst urban decay. The project was organized by a local nonprofit that also held workshops on voting rights, linking the act of artistic creation with concrete political action. Participants reported that the process of collaborating on a luminous artwork made them feel a collective responsibility toward their neighborhood, translating the aesthetic experience into a civic commitment. This example illustrates how metamodern art can serve as a catalyst for community organization, echoing the earlier point that feeling can be a precursor to doing. Similarly, Ted Lasso inspired a grassroots movement in several UK towns where local football clubs adopted the show's "Believe" mantra as a rallying cry for inclusive community sports programs. The clubs partnered with mental health charities, using the show's emphasis on emotional openness to promote counseling services for young athletes. In a 2022 interview, the show's creator, Bill Lawrence, remarked, "If a sitcom can get people to talk about their feelings, maybe that's a small step toward a more compassionate society." The movement when we turn our gaze toward the criticisms that have gathered around metamodernism. We find ourselves standing at the edge of a bustling intellectual marketplace, where every claim is shouted, every nuance contested, and every possibility weighed against the weight of history. The first line of attack that scholars often raise is the accusation of vagueness, that metamodernism, for all its seductive promise of a structure of feeling, remains a term so loosely defined that it threatens to dissolve into the very postmodern ambiguity it claims to move beyond. As the cultural theorist Luke Turner has warned, the danger of a philosophy that refuses to be pinned down is that it becomes a decorative label rather than a substantive framework. In other words, if we cannot say exactly what metamodernism is, how can we claim it offers a new direction for thought? This critique is not without merit. When we read the early manifestos of Vermeulen and van den Akker, we encounter a series of poetic statements, oscillation, sensing, engagement, that read more like a mood board than a rigorous philosophical taxonomy. The language is intentionally effective, designed to capture the lived experience of a generation caught between the cynicism of postmodern irony and the earnestness of modernist hope. Yet the very effective register that gives metamodernism its emotive power also opens the door for accusations of imprecision. Critics such as Adrian Johnston have argued that the lack of a clear ontological grounding leaves metamodernism vulnerable to being co-opted by any cultural trend that wishes to appear progressive. If the concept can be stretched to accommodate everything from indie music festivals to corporate branding, does it lose its critical edge? A second line of criticism focuses on Eurocentrism. The genealogy of metamodernism is traced through a lineage of Western philosophers, Heidegger, Lyotard, Baudrillard, and contemporary artists and writers predominantly based in Europe and North America. Scholars such as Radhika Parameswaran have pointed out that the discourse often overlooks the rich, pre-existing traditions of oscillatory thought in non-Western cultures, from the Buddhist middle way to the African concept of Ubuntu. By framing metamodernism as a response to the postmodern condition that emerged in the West, the theory risks reproducing the very cultural hegemony it seeks to transcend. If metamodernism is to claim universality, it must first reckon with its own geographical and cultural blind spots. A third, perhaps more pointed, criticism suggests that metamodernism is nothing more than a rebranding of existing trends, a clever marketing of the same ideas that have circulated under different names for decades. The term postmodern, for example, has been used in various academic circles since the early 1990s, and the notion of double consciousness or dialectical synthesis can be found in the works of earlier thinkers like Hegel, Sartre, and even the Frankfurt School. As the literary critic Peter Hallward observes, the novelty of metamodernism lies less in its conceptual content than in its aesthetic packaging. If the core ideas are already present elsewhere, what does the new label truly add? In the face of these robust criticisms, two counter-examples emerge that defend metamodernism's distinctiveness. The first rests on the explicit methodological oscillation that metamodernism foregrounds. Unlike postmodernism's steady play of deconstruction or modernism's relentless forward thrust, metamodernism proposes a deliberate, rhythmic movement between sincerity and irony, hope and doubt, reconstruction and critique. This oscillation is not a vague feeling but a methodological tool, a kind of epistemic pendulum that allows scholars and artists to hold contradictory positions in tension without collapsing into nihilism. In practice, this means that a metamodern writer might adopt a postmodern pastiche in one chapter, then shift to a heartfelt confession in the next, all the while maintaining an awareness of the dialogue between the two. As Vermeulen and van den Akker put it, we do not abandon irony, we resituate it within a larger, more hopeful narrative. This methodological rigor, oscillation as a disciplined practice rather than a fleeting mood, offers a concrete way to differentiate metamodernism from its predecessors. The second counterexample lies in metamodernism's applicability to global digital cultures, a realm that postmodernism never fully anticipated. The rise of social media platforms, meme economies, and transnational digital communities has created a cultural ecology where the boundaries between irony and sincerity blur, and where participants constantly navigate between global trends and local identities. In this environment, the metamodern oscillation becomes a lived strategy. Take, for instance, the phenomenon of deep fakes and AI-generated avatars that simultaneously parody and embody genuine emotional expression. Users may share a meme that appears to mock a political figure, yet the same meme can also convey a sincere yearning for change, thereby embodying the metamodern tension between critique and construction. As media scholar Alexander Galloway notes, the digital age demands a philosophy that can hold both the simulacrum and the authentic in the same breath, a demand that metamodernism is uniquely positioned to meet. To illustrate how these arguments play out in concrete history, let us turn to two vivid anecdotes that prefigure the metamodern condition. The first takes us back to the cusp of the new millennium, to the global panic surrounding the IT-1000 bug. As the year 1999 gave way to 2000, governments, corporations, and ordinary citizens braced for a digital apocalypse. The belief that computer systems would fail to recognize the change from 99 to 0, potentially collapsing power grids, banking systems, and transportation networks. Media coverage was saturated with apocalyptic forecasts, yet at the same time, a counter-narrative of calm preparation and even optimism emerged. Engineers worked tirelessly to patch code, while artists and musicians produced songs that celebrated the dawn of a new era. This simultaneous dread and hope, this collective oscillation between fear of collapse and belief in human ingenuity, captured what scholars now refer to as meta-anxiety. It was not merely postmodern irony about technological failure, nor was it a naive modernist faith in progress. It was a metamodern posture that acknowledged the precariousness of the moment while still daring to imagine a better outcome. In the words of the cybersecurity analyst Bruce Schneier, we were terrified, but we also felt empowered to act, a paradox that defines the metamodern spirit. The second anecdote jumps forward to 2021, when AI-generated art burst onto the cultural scene, challenging long-standing notions of authenticity, authorship, and creative labor. Platforms like Midjourney, DALL-E, and Stable Diffusion allowed anyone with a textual prompt to produce images that rivaled the technical skill of professional painters. The art world reacted with a mixture of fascination and alarm. Critics argued that machines were merely remixing existing data, reducing art to algorithmic output. Yet artists themselves began to embrace the technology, using it as a collaborative partner, a new brush with which to explore uncanny visual realms. The debate was not simply about whether AI could create real art. It was about what it meant to be an author in an age where the line between human intention and machine generation is increasingly porous. This tension between the postmodern suspicion of originality and the modernist yearning for authentic expression exemplifies metamodernism's core oscillation. As the digital artist Rafik Anadol reflected, the algorithm is not a thief. It is a mirror that reflects our collective imagination back to us, inviting us to co-author the future. The AI art phenomenon thus serves as a living laboratory for metamodern theory, demonstrating how the framework can illuminate the ethical and aesthetic dilemmas of our time. Having examined both the criticisms and the defenses, we now turn to the horizon. What future trajectories might metamodernism pursue? One promising avenue is its integration with post-humanist thought. Posthumanism, with its emphasis on decentering the human subject, resonates with metamodernism's willingness to oscillate beyond anthropocentric narratives. Thinkers such as Rossi Braidotti and Kerry Wolf have argued for a post-human subjectivity that is fluid, relational, and constantly in flux. Metamodernism can enrich this discourse by providing a methodological rhythm. The post-humanist critique of human exceptionalism can be paired with a metamodern, hopeful reconstruction of new forms of agency, be they cyborg assemblages, ecological collectives, or digital symbioses. In this partnership, the oscillation becomes a bridge, allowing us to move from the post-humanist deconstruction of the human to a constructive vision of what might emerge when humanity reconfigures itself in concert with technology and other species. A second trajectory points toward ecological metaphysics, a field that seeks to reconceptualize the relationship between being and the environment. The climate crisis has forced philosophers to reconsider the metaphysical assumptions that underlie our exploitation of nature. Metamodernism's oscillatory stance offers a fertile ground for such reconsideration. On one hand, it acknowledges the postmodern critique that our scientific narratives have often been complicit in ecological domination. On the other hand, it refuses to succumb to despair, instead proposing a renewed, hopeful engagement with the Earth, a a sensing of planetary interdependence that is both critical and constructive. Scholars like Timothy Morton with his notion of hyperobjects and Karen Barad with her agential realism already echo metamodern sensibilities. They blend rigorous analysis of ecological entanglement with an effective call to care. Metamodernism can serve as the philosophical glue that binds these insights, providing a cultural grammar for expressing ecological grief while simultaneously nurturing regenerative imagination. A third, more speculative direction envisions a meta-postmodern synthesis, a stage where the insights of postmodern deconstruction are fully integrated into a metamodern framework that transcends both irony and naive optimism. This would not be a simple linear progression but a dialectical loop, reminiscent of Hegelian sublation, where the thesis of modernist grand narratives, the antithesis of postmodern skepticism, and the synthesis of metamodern oscillation coalesce into a new mode of thought. In such a synthesis, the postmodern awareness of the contingency of truth would be preserved, while the metamodern drive toward constructive meaning would be amplified. The result could be a philosophical stance capable of navigating the paradoxes of the 21st century, globalization, digital immersion, and existential risk, without collapsing into either fatalism or uncritical optimism. As the literary critic Jason Josephson Storm has suggested, the future of philosophy may lie not in abandoning the past, but in learning to hold its contradictions in a sustained, generative tension. Metamodernism, with its built-in oscillation, is uniquely equipped for that task. All these forward-looking possibilities circle back to the promise we made at the beginning of our exploration, that understanding metamodernism can illuminate pathways for personal meaning-making and collective action. On a personal level, the oscillatory practice invites us to sit with our own contradictions, to acknowledge the anxiety that arises from the climate emergency, the political fragmentation, and the rapid acceleration of technology, while also daring to imagine hopeful narratives that give those anxieties shape and direction. When we feel the pull of cynicism, we can deliberately swing toward sincerity, not as a denial of the former feeling, but as a complementary response. This practice mirrors the ancient Stoic exercise of premeditatio malorum, yet it is updated for a digital age where the threats are both global and algorithmic. By internalizing the metamodern rhythm, we cultivate a resilience that is neither brittle optimism nor corrosive nihilism. Collectively, the same oscillation can inform social movements and policy. Consider climate activism that blends the postmodern critique of corporate narratives with a modernist call for systemic transformation. The Fridays for Future protests, for instance, are steeped in scientific data, the postmodern insistence on evidence, while simultaneously invoking a moral urgency that feels almost religious in its hopefulness. This blend of critique and construction is precisely the metamodern mode. Moreover, the digital cultures we discussed earlier, memes, AI art, participatory platforms, show how a global community can co-create meaning in real time, oscillating between play and seriousness, between subversion and solidarity. When policymakers adopt a metamodern lens, they might design legislation that acknowledges the complexity of social problems, the postmodern awareness of multiplicity, while also committing to bold, forward-looking solutions, the modernist drive for progress. In this way, metamodernism becomes more than an academic label. It becomes a practical ethic for navigating an era defined by rapid change and deep uncertainty. In reflecting on the criticisms, we see that they serve a vital function. They remind us that any philosophical project must remain vigilant against becoming a fashionable veneer. The charge of vagueness pushes us to articulate clearer definitions. The accusation of Eurocentrism urges us to expand our canon. The claim of rebranding compels us to demonstrate genuine novelty. Yet the counter-examples of methodological oscillation and digital applicability demonstrate that metamodernism does more than repurpose old ideas. It offers a lived, procedural logic that can be observed in the very fabric of contemporary culture. The historical anecdotes of it, 1000 and AI-generated art are not mere curiosities. They are empirical touchstones that reveal how the oscillatory pattern manifests in moments of collective anxiety and creative disruption. Looking ahead, the integration with post-humanist thought may help us reconceive the self not as a solitary, rational agent, but as an assemblage of biological, technological, and ecological forces. The ecological metaphysics trajectory may guide us toward a planetary ethic that balances critique of exploitation with constructive stewardship. And the meta-postmodern synthesis may provide a philosophical architecture capable of holding the contradictions that define our time without dissolving into paralysis. Each of these pathways, while distinct, shares a common thread: the willingness to sit in the tension between opposing poles, to let that tension generate new forms of understanding. As we draw this segment to a close, let us pause and listen to the quiet that follows the oscillation. In that stillness, we might hear the echo of a question that has guided philosophers for centuries. What does it mean to live meaningfully in a world that is simultaneously fragile and resilient, fragmented and interconnected? Metamodernism does not claim to have the final answer, but it offers a compass, a way to navigate the shifting terrain with both critical eyes and hopeful hearts. It reminds us that the future is not a predetermined line, but a series of waves we can ride, sometimes cresting, sometimes troughing, but always moving forward. In embracing that rhythm, we may find the personal meaning we seek and the collective momentum needed to shape a more humane, sustainable, and imaginative world.